Okay, perfect. So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's IES Forum. So our forum series hosts leading professionals to present on the chosen topic before we then open the floor to attendees to have an open floor discussion, essentially. So our aim is to host events which provide you with a platform to engage, knowledge exchange, debate, and share best practice. So I hope that will be exactly what this event today provides you. So today's forum is going to discuss how COVID-19 pandemic has impacted on the research landscape for environmental science and associated funding for environmental research. So we're going to explore how PhD research projects have been impacted, changes to funding opportunities and restrictions that they're facing, and the lasting impact this could have on many substantial and long-standing research projects. So essentially, what does a career in environmental science now look like, and a research position at that? So hopefully we're going to discuss that today. So our speakers, Robin Thomas from NERC, Jessica Potts, PhD student at Bangor University, and Professor Chad Stanton at University of the West of England are going to explore exactly that today. So each speaker will deliver a presentation before we then open the floor for discussion, for you to submit your questions to any of the three speakers and discuss some of the key points raised and share your experiences in this area. So we unfortunately lost one of our speakers last minute due to personal circumstances. So I just want to thank Chad Stadden again for stepping in at very short notice. It's great to have you on board. So for you as attendees, to ask questions, you can use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. You can submit your questions at any point during the forum. If you have a question that's particular for one particular speaker, please add their initials at the beginning, and Chad, who will be our chair, will ask these on your behalf. You've also got the option to speak and use your audio to communicate with the speakers directly if you wish to. So please use the raise hand function, which you'll see in the participants box. This will notify us that you want to speak, and we'll then grant you that access so that you can use your microphone. So let's get started. Our first presentation will be presented by Rob Thomas, Associate Director at Natural Environment Research Council, commonly known as NERC. So as Associate Director for Discovery Science, Talent and Skills, Robin leads three core teams within NERC's Research and Skills Directorate: Business Management, Funding Operations, and Talent and Skills, and oversees the Discovery Science Fellowships and Students funding streams. So it's a pleasure to have you join us today, Robin. I'm now going to hand over to you and take up no more time. So if you just want to share your screen, and all other speakers just switch off your cameras, that would be brilliant.
Great. Well, thank you. There you go. There you go. Good. Well, thank you for having me. It's good to be asked and good to be here. Here for me physically is Bristol, although we are headquartered as UK Research and Innovation in Swindon. But as a couple of us were discussing just before the seminar kicked off, I haven't been to Swindon since early March, and so the backdrop for me has been sunny Bristol for some time, and I'm quite enjoying that lack of commute, if I'm honest. So I was asked just to come along and give a little bit of an overview to the research and innovation landscape, and particularly in the COVID-19 world. And what's the perspective of a funder in that space? As Rihanna was saying, my background is as working in a policy space in the research and innovation system for many years, and my current portfolio within NERC is what we call responsive mode, so effectively blue skies research, fundamental research questions through the discovery science funding channels, and also a role in the talent and skills funding streams. So looking at those, how we fund the next generation and upcoming generations of environmental scientists through the UK research and innovation funding streams. So I guess never entirely sure in the audience who knows the background, but a couple of years ago, UK Research and Innovation was formed as one entity and one organisation. So NERC plus 8 other sister research councils became part of UK Research and Innovation. And as UK Research and Innovation, our vision and our mission is wide-ranging and various. But at the core, over the last 12 months or so, has been a commitment by the UK government to aim to increase investment in research and development and research and innovation to around 2.4% of gross domestic product, and to do that by 2027. And I think that's it's a good goal to have. It would involve a significant increase in the actual amount of money flowing into the research and innovation system. But one of the key things, and one of the areas that I particularly therefore focus on for my sort of responsibility, is in that kind of red box that sits on the screen, which is how do we make sure that we've got the foundations to actually achieve that vision? How do we make sure that there are people in the system to do that, and how is that system trusted and diverse? And I think one of the things that should run through this presentation, and one of the key things that's interesting for me, is that because of the driver that we have as UK Research and Innovation, we've shifted from a position where actually we expect a pathway to be a PhD into postdoc into research, and sort of a research pathway, to one that's a lot broader and a lot more diverse, and that's something that's important, and even in a post-COVID world, will be fundamental for us in thinking about how we provide the skills and foundations for the UK system. Just to give kind of a perspective of the whole UKRI portfolio around doctoral training and talent investment, UKRI's budget is around just under £8 billion per year, and that means that we at any one time are supporting 50,000 plus researchers, around 28,000 students and studentships, and a significant number of kind of early career fellows through the research system. And so moving towards that underpinning foundation. And as an organisation, we have I guess a kind of a strategy that is built around 3 main things. We are a funder, so we are there to administer the money, the funds. We also have a role, I guess, then as a convener and to provide that sort of leadership through policy and practice. But also we are an employer of researchers, of those who oversee studentships and PhDs through the institutes and facilities that we manage. So many of the issues that are research organisations who are primarily funded by us actually are experienced by members of UKRI directly as well. Just to put NERC in context, this slide gives an overview of the talent and skills portfolio that I oversee. And so on the left-hand side of the slide, in the green and orange boxes, we see, I guess, particularly the investment that we make in studentships. So £20 million per annum, roughly through responsive studentships, which mean that in doctoral training partnerships, the topics chosen by students or supervisors themselves. but we also put a smaller amount of money into what we refer to as directed studentships through Centres for Doctoral Training. And those are really around a particular challenge, a particular skills need, or a particular skills gap that's identified in the NERC and environmental science community more broadly. And so we have in the recent years funded particular centres for doctoral training in renewable energy with UPSRC, in Earth observation and space with the UK Space Agency, in other areas like I guess soils and freshwater and other spaces as well. So just to, again, put that in context, at any one time, my team are overseeing across around 5 financial years worth of kind of rolling investment, about £225 million of NERC core investment. And we're working with 74 academic partners across the whole of the UK. The dots that you can see across the map of the UK there are where NERC funds doctoral training partnerships or centres for doctoral training, and the spread is across the whole of the map, which I think is an important thing for us to note as well. But that means through Centres for Doctoral Training and Doctoral Training Partnerships, we have funding and funded around 1,400 active studentships at any one time, which for us, I guess, made the impacts of COVID-19 arriving a very pertinent question and a difficult one to handle. So I think it won't be any surprise to you, sort of the left-hand side, we've all experienced, I imagine, these bullet points in particular ways: overnight closures of offices, universities, and particularly with respect to sort of researchers, the laboratories and scientific facilities that are used in research projects and research programs. Work from home became a standard, and therefore there were challenges that came with that, depending on one's personal circumstances, and also increased numbers of caring commitments that interrupted work patterns, and there were new and difficult and sometimes beneficial, but sometimes different work patterns that people were experiencing. And I guess as the situation from March developed into April, developed into May, particularly important for the environmental science research space, is the fact that field seasons have been lost and potentially will be lost going forward in the future. And it's difficult for us to predict exactly how that will change and how it will develop. And so these are, I guess, some of the key issues that we are working with. And I think for us as UK Research and Innovation, we are able to do some things to address some of these issues, whilst also needing to take a little bit of stock to understand the scale and the breadth of the challenge. So in early on in April 2020, we approved costed extensions for those students in their final year of their PhDs, and also issued guidance that I think it's probably fair to say developed. It was relatively high level when it first appeared in April, and developed as feedback from the community was provided. And that guidance was to both students directly and to those who actually have the hold on the grants that the students are funded by, so training grant holders. And then I guess through May to most recently, we have been working with those training grant holders to really get to, I guess, grips with the extent of the challenge as students have shifted to a situation where they're not able to work in laboratories, they're not able to easily go out in the field, they're not able to perhaps do the planned research that they had planned at the beginning, and how, therefore, we as a funder can support the training grant holders to support students as a result. And we are, I guess, at the point where 2 surveys have been rolled out, and we are just looking at the second of those, and some of the results from focus groups that we've been running around how we need to think about supporting the wider student base and student population. I'm not sure how many students are actually online, but if you are online, this is kind of the best place to go for the most up-to-date information through UK research and innovation, and also directly to training grant holders. So when these slides are sent around, this is just a snapshot of the website, but also that link will take you straight to the sort of guidance for students and studentships generally, as the most up-to-date piece of information that we have. So I think for students, current and potentially future, this picture potentially showed what it looked like before COVID-19, and it's changed in no, it hasn't changed at all really, I guess, and potentially got slightly darker in terms of light at this point in time. But it really does mean that that students have to think, I guess, early on around what sort of decisions they will take about the path that their career will take in terms of environmental science, and the pathway is not always 100% clear. Much the same as any sort of career pathway isn't 100% clear when one starts out. I guess it's difficult without being able to sort of step into each individual context to give much advice in that sense. But what we do know through some analysis, I guess, from a couple of years ago, is that for environmental science fund PhDs, increasingly those PhDs are important in either securing a job or moving into the next stage of one's career. And we spent some time last year looking at the 2002, 2004 and 2007 cohort of students, and just over 90% of them were still using the environmental science that they had studied as part of their PhD in their job. And I guess another key thing to say is that those jobs are not always through the academic pathway. In fact, most of those jobs, or so a growing significant portion of those jobs, are outside of the academic community and outside of the university and the research institutes that perhaps would have been expected in the past. And so just over 2/3 of just around 2/3 of the 2004 and 2007 cohorts are actually going from their PhD into an academic research position or following an academic pathway. A greater number are going into business, into government and policy organisations, and working with charities. So even with a COVID-19 lens, I think that is potentially and should be a positive sort of story for PhD training in a post-COVID world, and that actually we see the pathways growing beyond the academic sector, a breadth of skills and training that is developing applicable skills, and also increasingly a core pillar of NERC strategies around investing in people to shape environmental solutions that are not wholly and solely academic in their opinion. So that brings me to the end. Just to remind us, I guess, that I think one of the things that we struggle with as UK research and innovation is shifting the mindset of colleagues across the academic community, particularly those who advise students to actually think more broadly about why UK research and innovation invests in talent. And that is to invest in the talent for the UK economy, society, and environmental sort of sustainability more broadly, and building that capacity and capability to look at a future workforce and how and the skills that are required in that, and also to nurture and develop that talent in different ways, and particularly looking at how we can do that is a key thing that will shape our agenda in a post-COVID sort of environment and world. So at that, I'm going to end with a black screen and hand over, I think, to Chad.
Thank you very much, Robin. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can.
Excellent. I'd like to just pick up on one question that's come in specifically related to one of your slides, I think. The question is there more recent data available? I think referring to the graduate destinations slide you showed us a few from the end.
Yes, there is. It hasn't been fully pulled together yet. I think we are currently looking at the 2010 and 2012 cohorts. And we should have that coming through, I hope, in the autumn. I think so. One of the things for us is that in the kind of this last 6 months, a lot of the things that we would have been doing have been shifted, deprioritized, and knocked out of kilter. And that's the type of thing that I would have liked to have in January, but we're now sort of at the end of September, or at least in the middle of September, without those sorts of things. And that's largely because most of my team was shifted to dealing with immediate issues around COVID. So we will have those soon.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, we're perfectly on time, so let's move on to our second speaker. Jessica Potts is a final year PhD student studying the impacts of neonicotinoid pesticides on soil ecology and function at Bangor University. And like many, COVID-19 has brought new hurdles for Jessica, including postponed or cancelled research projects, disrupted lab work, and changes to living arrangements and family dynamics. Today, she's going to share with us her experience in undertaking a PhD during a pandemic. Over to you, Jessica.
Okay, thank you. Let's see if I can get this screen sharing to work well. Okay.
Works for me.
Yeah, you can all see that? Perfect. Okay, so as Chaz said, I'm a fourth year PhD student at Bangor University, and I'm going to be talking about actually what my experience with doing my PhD during a pandemic has been. But firstly, I want to say that everybody's PhD experience has been totally different. We've all been going through the same storm, but we've all been in a different boat. We've all had different resources, different levels of support, and different ways of coping with what's been happening. So what I'm going to be talking about is my experience and my pathway through it, but there may be many parallels or stuff that other PhD students and even supervisors will see mirrored in the experiences I've been going through. So as I said, kind of go through my pandemic timeline, kind of what the highs and lows have been, what support I've had. So actually, I'm very lucky to be one of the NERC-funded CDT students. So I'm a STARS student, so I look at soil science, and then also look to the future. Actually, what does COVID mean for kind of the future landscape of a PhD researcher, or kind of what we can take away from this to actually shape and alter how we may run our research projects. So yeah, kind of 4th year at Bangor University, looking at neonicotinoids in soil, and I was expected to finish this coming March. However, not anymore. Luckily, I was one of these lucky few who are finishing within the next 12 months, and I have been granted a 6-month extension. Still a few issues floating around there as I'm match funded, so kind of got to get the university to sign off it as well. But at least I've been able and been offered this extension to be able to try and claim back as much of the time as I lost during lockdown. So kind of where did lockdown kind of start for me? Where did this all begin? So March is when we all started to hear these whispers of COVID. None of us really knowing exactly what it meant, believing actually it's like flu, not really going to affect us, will mainly affect other people. And then the rumours started happening. They started flying around the university. University-wide ban on international travel in Bangor came down so quickly. Before any other university we'd heard of closing down, Bangor was saying you're not allowed to go anywhere anymore. And then along with this came the rumours of the labs closing, but still nothing certain. And then bang, straight away, overnight, you've got to finish your lab work, you've got to get out, the university is closing. And at this point, kind of, I'm based up in North Wales. My support network in North Wales, unfortunately, is very small, and I didn't want to be stuck, locked down here by myself. So I actually moved back home. I went down south to my parents' house, and I actually arrived 2 days before the official lockdown was announced. And at this point, everything was kind of put on hold indefinitely. None of us really knew what was going on. And then here comes lockdown. And actually, there are obviously a lot of lows, but there were actually some things that actually went quite nicely. So obviously the first hints that funded extensions may be possible, and this kind of gave us all this sigh of relief. We didn't have to use COVID to be as productive as we were whilst normality was still happening, because that just wasn't going to happen. And then kind of I was meant to be presenting at conferences, and they all moved online. I had my first kind of session as a convener at the EGU, which was meant to be in Vienna, and it was held online. And actually it worked really nicely. We had good attendance. And actually from talking to people felt more comfortable actually getting involved in the conversations, because there was that level of anonymity. People felt more able to ask and to participate. Then there were kind of the hurdles and the lows. So I'm from a massive family. There were 7 of us living in one house with 4 bedrooms. And actually I then became the homeschooling tutor for my younger siblings. Both my parents were having to work full time. My mum was a key worker. So actually it became nigh on impossible to find time to fit my own work in around homeschooling my siblings. And then this all came to a point when I had to have my annual review. And I didn't have 12 months worth of work to show them, or at least not what I felt 12 months worth should be like. And this was stressful, this was daunting, but luckily it kind of worked out. I've got a great support network from my university. My supervisors are fantastic. And they helped reassure me that actually kind of the pandemic's happening. You don't know what's going on. We don't know what's going on. Try your best, stay sane, being the number one key point. And then once it's all over, or we can resume some level of normality, we can figure out actually how to make this work. And then kind of we start to ease out of lockdown. However, I wasn't allowed back into Wales yet. Wales still had a lockdown. And even when Wales announced that it was reopening its doors to the public of the UK, I still decided to wait a little bit longer to avoid the rush of tourists going back into Wales, not wanting to basically be locked down in my own house again. And then the lab started to reopen on a limited and restricted basis. So we've now got to kind of book in 2-hour slots, know exactly what you're doing when you go in, have it fully set out, and clean everything down and be out again before the next person comes in. And whilst we're allowed in the labs, whilst this is starting to resume some sense of normality, working from home is still expected to kind of continue for the foreseeable future, especially since the office that I tend to work in is actually in a teaching building. And if the undergraduate students start being brought back in, then actually I'm going to avoid it. And something that kept me sane, so Twitter has been an amazing resource actually in terms of connecting with other academics and other PhD students feeling the same thing. And right at the beginning of the pandemic, right at the beginning of lockdown, I saw this quote, and actually it helped me remember that I'm not at home by choice. I'm at home because I have to be, and therefore it's not my fault if my productivity is affected, if my results aren't necessarily as good as I'd like them to be, if my outcomes aren't the standard that I generally hold myself to. And I think this is something a lot of other PhD students, other postgrads, they're also feeling, and all students across the board. So a lot of our supervisors may be seeing that we've got a lack of motivation, may be seeing that there's an increased absence, that we're not turning up to stuff, that we're not replying to emails, that our results are delayed, but actually they may not quite realise that everything else going on around us is affecting us, possibly more so than our supervisors, because we are generally isolated from our families, from our support networks. We also generally don't earn enough to live in a house that has adequate working space. We're generally fitting in little desks into little corners of rooms and not being able to separate that work and home life anymore. And actually that all muddles together and become quite difficult and quite anxiety provoking. Luckily though, and I think the main thing to help combat most of this is the support that academic supervisors and academic networks can provide. And luckily, as I said before, I'm a NERC-funded, NERC and BBSRC funded CDT student. So as part of STARS, so as our soil training and research studentships, we're actually quite a sizable cohort. And STARS have been, they've been amazing. They have had monthly catch-ups and check-ins. We've had team meetings and Zoom meetings, checking how we're doing, talking actually about what's going on, telling us the newest kind of NERC information, what's going on with our funding, reassuring us that they'll try their best to try and help us with it. They've also run sessions or put on sessions run by professionals into resilience and mindfulness, just basically also building on these other soft skills that may be forgotten about that actually become vital and extremely useful for actually dealing with these situations that none of us expected to find ourselves in. They're also starting to move towards providing more online training. So STARS, probably like many other CDTs, have been amazing in the face-to-face training programs they've been running since I've started. And they have continued to do so, but online since the pandemic. So I've been a part of some online design programs. So I'm in a 6-month program run by InfoHackit, learning how to use design software and how to use that to create posters and figures and visual abstracts. And actually this allows you the opportunity to work on something that's still within your sphere of work, but maybe something that you feel is slightly more engaging or doesn't require the same amount of kind of physical, mental and emotional effort to sit down and write your thesis. It's still doing something that plays a part, but isn't necessarily as draining. So I think I'm coming to the end here, but kind of where do we go from here? I mean, I'm being encouraged to move maybe towards more but smaller and faster lab experiments. This way, especially if there's another lockdown in winter, then I'll have less work that's been lost. Because actually at the very beginning of lockdown, I had field experiments that I had to cancel. I had lab work that I had to finish early. And also I lost a full field season. I work with soil, I work with invertebrate, and unfortunately, a lot of them are seasonally dependent. And like many other environmental researchers, this is actually going to play a big part. If we're locked down in winter, we're locked down in summer, we're going to have to rethink actually how we can maintain the level of our research and maintain the level of our data in much shorter, more restricted timeframes, and maybe with more restricted movement. Whether this be leaning towards a higher emphasis on models over fresh field data. We'll have to see. And yeah, working with living organisms is difficult enough without having lockdown getting in the way. So that is me, and I'm just going to finish on this slide, which just kind of shows the overall timeline and actually the ups and downs and the hurdles and the unknowns of doing a PhD in a pandemic. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Jessica. I'm just checking the chat box and the QA to see if there are any clarifying questions. I'm not seeing any. We will have lots of time for discussion after the third presentation. So I can imagine a lot of participations are collecting the thoughts and experiences of the presenters, and then we'll launch into discussion a bit more actively when we get to that part of the agenda. So let's move on. I will share my screen and share my thoughts with you, not from a student's perspective or from a funder's perspective, but from a supervisor's perspective. Okay. So that should be sharing. Can someone confirm for me that they're seeing a...
Yeah, that all looks great, Chad.
Good, excellent. Fantastic.
Oh, if you just, in your display settings at the top, we can see your notes at the moment. So yeah, if you just swap presenter view.
There we go.
Perfect.
Lovely. So as I said, I'll be reflecting on the experience of postgraduate researchers, supervisors. And I am currently based at the University of the West of England, where most of my work lives at the interface between natural science, engineering, and social science, and focuses on questions related to sustainable and secure water management. Okay, just 3 slides of thoughts to share with you over the next 10 minutes or so. The first, thinking about some of the operational impacts. Lab access and our ability to travel, even locally, was suddenly curtailed after the 23rd of March. And one of my students, Josh, was physically hustled away from the scanning electron microscope, having only just managed to complete some of the work he was doing in that part of his research program. And that's a story that I've heard not just from around my university, but from around the sector. And Jessica reflected on that from the student's perspective. 1 minute you're working and everything's fine. In the next moment we're working and there's some uncertainties around this thing called COVID-19. And then very suddenly it all stops. And that suddenness for some colleagues, I think, and for some students has had some really deleterious impacts in terms of losing field work or lab work that was perhaps underway. My heart really goes out to those students, not like Josh, fortunately. He managed to just finish his cycle of work, but those PhD students who might have had longer running experiments set up in the lab in previous weeks or months and intended to run on past the 23rd of March, because of course nobody knew that there would be a lockdown that would then forbid us for a period of time from accessing our lab facilities. In some cases, I know that postgraduate researchers were able to work with facilities managers and their supervisors, their directors of study, to keep their studies going. In others, unfortunately, entire experiments have been lost. And Jessica also reflected that with the best will in the world, of course, there wasn't much she could do about losing a season. So for those of our PGRs who were involved in work that needed to be done during the summertime, during the late spring and summertime, when plants, animals, and whatnot are going through that spring-summer cycle, it's irrecoverable. It's not possible to recover that time. Once the time is gone, you can't just start doing that kind of work in mid or late September, because the ecological season has moved on. But it's not just physical scientists who've lost data collection opportunities and had their studies interrupted. We've got other students in our group who are more on the social science side, and they lost interviews, focus groups, etc. As a supervisor, we were put in the position overnight of trying to help our students who were doing that kind of work figure out how to do it online. So I must have been part of, I don't know how many dozens of conversations about how to move interviews, surveys, focus groups online. And I say here, our love-hate relationship with Zoom. The University of the West of England is starting to open up again. I was there yesterday. I had lunch with some of my postgraduate researchers, and the first thing I said to them, it's a bit of a running gag now, is so nice to see you in 3 dimensions. Because, and I think we've all learned this, as good as Zoom, MS Teams, Collaborate, and other tools have proved to be during lockdown when we had no other alternatives, there's a lot of communication, a lot of interaction, a lot of director of study supervisory work you can't easily do on Zoom. For example, it's more difficult to pick up on body language, as well as, of course, being able to physically assist with lab or social science research. My third bullet point is, I think, an unfortunate truth. If we're honest, we would have to acknowledge that postgraduate researchers kind of got left behind. We went into lockdown, undergraduate programs, postgraduate taught programs, so master's programs, all came first. They had to go online in real time, and that was a huge challenge. I do think, not just at my institution, but around the country, postgraduate researchers tended to get pushed to the back of the queue. Not because there was any intention to overlook them, but because there was only a limited amount of bandwidth. And I know myself and my colleagues from the end of March through to May, early June, were working 7 days a week. You know, all the hours that were available were invested in trying to help the largest groups of students complete their studies, with the unintended consequence that postgraduate researchers were sometimes overlooked. I also want to highlight something else, which is that at UWI Bristol, and I think around the country, it is often the case that postgraduate researchers are also lecturers and instructors. So imagine being someone like Jessica, who's suddenly having to deal with all of the challenges that her project is facing, and her supervisor's trying to help her do that. Simultaneously, she's faced with the challenge of moving some undergraduate or postgraduate learning online for her own students. So I think postgraduate researchers in that situation were suffering under a double burden that's perhaps under-recognized. Both Robin and Jessica have talked about the funding story. Depending on how your studies are funded, there were different kinds of solutions on offer, but they weren't offered overnight. It took a while for funders like UKRI or the European Commission or private foundation funders to figure out how to deal with these new costs, these additional costs that were implied by suddenly parking postgraduate projects for 3 to 6 months. And I would like to acknowledge a truth about bureaucracies. There was a tendency not so much with the funders, I think, but with university bureaucracies, to kind of pretend like everything is fine and to assume that somehow moving online can be done relatively seamlessly so that progression milestones, vivas, etc., should be relatively smooth, when of course we know they weren't. There was a whole lot of adjustment and reasonable adjustment that the bureaucracies for managing postgraduate researchers really did need to take on board and acknowledge before we could all move forward together. My final point on the operational side is just an acknowledgement that for some of my students at any rate, lockdown was actually helpful. It happens that I have some students who at that time were just entering the writing up phase. They'd done all of their data collection. We'd been through all of that work with them before March 2020. And a couple of them actually commented that lockdown was helpful because in the context within which they lived, which presumably did not involve a 4-bedroom house with 7 people and trying to run a home school on the side, they found the solitude, the peace, the quiet to progress their writing. On the professional side, in terms of impacts and thinking about what we as supervisors were trying to do, I've already mentioned funding challenges, and the answers to those funding challenges were rather varied. And they were either relatively quick in coming, in my experience, from some private foundation funders, where the decision process is quite short and compact, possibly the European Commission at the other end of the spectrum. You would not define the European Commission as a short and compact decision system or structure. And as postgraduate supervisors, it fell to us to help manage the anxieties, the uncertainties, and quite frankly, the financial necessities of that period of time. I'm aware of some supervisors who loaned money to their students because there was no other way their students, given their particular living circumstances, were going to be able to stay fed, stay warm, etc. As a postgraduate supervisor, it's been challenging thinking about how to manage some of the bottlenecks and challenges with public statutory regulatory bodies, like IES, like the Royal Geographical Society, the Chartered Institute for Water and Environmental Management, and others. And also thinking about how, in some cases, our postgraduate researchers' projects are linked to private sector employers. And that provided another set of challenges in our team, where the private sector sponsors still needed some productivity. They still needed some outputs so that they could progress what they could progress, notwithstanding the challenges that we and our students were facing. They were quite understanding, but from a business point of view, they still needed to move on in certain ways. And it was up to us to work together to figure out how to do that, given that the access to university facilities, labs, etc., was shut down very abruptly. I want to pick up on something that Robin pointed out. He noted in one of his slides that something like 1/4 to 1/3 of PhD students don't go into a publicly funded university or research institute setting. That's particularly the case at the University of the West of England because of our experience as a new university, as an ex-poly. That's not so much a problem for now. It's a problem for what happens beyond now, tomorrow and into months and years coming, because a lot of our private sector partners and sponsors are saying they're slowing down recruitment. So whereas a year or two ago, when we recruited postgraduate students on knowledge transfer partnership type PhDs, we thought there was a clear pathway into the private sector, as well as a pathway into publicly funded universities and research institutes. That's less clear now. It's going to take some time for that conduit, that pathway away from universities and research institutes and towards being a PhD in a private institution to clarify itself and to resolve itself. It's quite unclear what's going to happen. There was a period of time in the spring where a lot of us were being challenged to think about how our research might help illuminate part of the COVID-19 story. I, at the time, said to my students, don't be anxious about this. If it's the case that your work does have a COVID angle to it, then we can work together to perhaps publicize that, and we might just have discovered something new, unique, and exciting about your work, which we can showcase. But please don't put yourself under any pressure to force fit a COVID link. Support for students. Like many universities, the University of the West of England scrambled to figure out how to support students. I've already acknowledged, to some extent, it took us longer than it should have to support postgraduate research students. But what has never been done to date is any offer of support to supervisors. Nobody has actually said, here's a set of guidelines about how to answer frequently asked questions. As a supervisor, we've been kind of left to our own judgment, experience, and human nature. Part of which, from my point of view, has been about what can I do to help keep PGRs engaged and involved? Okay, so some of my students had finished their data collection and they were in a writing phase, and so they were happy to be locked down with their word processors. Others had had data collection interrupted, and so we needed to deal with the implications and the anxieties around that. Still others were at the beginning part of their study, and so the impacts were different. For me as a supervisor, the challenge was to figure out how can I create an online context for them so they can still feel engaged, so that this is not lost time. We did a number of things. We set up an online weekly seminar that was impromptu, and each week another subject would come up, like how to use Zoom to do interviews, or have we learned anything from funding agencies about where our funding is going to go, etc. So it was partly support group, it was partly keeping the conversation going. But I also tried to inject some useful academic value. So where useful, I searched for literature and found stuff that my students hadn't yet read and said, well, if you've got nothing else to do today, you could do worse than read this. My final set of observations are about personal stories. It became really clear early on, and this is something that Jessica's commented on, that many of our PGRs did not have adequate home working space or facilities. They shared houses with lots of people, and so it was difficult to find a quiet space to work. They didn't have control over the Wi-Fi, and so often they would get bumped off calls because of bandwidth issues. And so when the university started to talk about reopening some of its facilities, I was asked, who should we prioritize? And I said we should prioritize staff or students who've identified that they don't have an appropriate working environment at home. I'm lucky. Many of us are lucky. We've got home studies that we're exclusive proprietors of. But that's not the case for all of our students, or indeed all of our staff, who suddenly found that lots of people were coming home and wanting to make use of space. The university also set up, and I think this is a common experience across the country, what's called the Digital Capability Scheme. So for those students who had a particular digital need to enable moving some of their learning, some of their research online, by about the end of April, we had a financial mechanism for helping them to make that happen. I've talked about creating an online community for our PGRs. Field of dreams, if you build it, will they come? The answer is that some will and some won't. And for those that didn't, I made a point of regularly phoning them up and saying, hey, Jessica, how are you getting on? Did you not come to our weekly meeting because you don't need us and you're perfectly happy working away on whatever it is you're doing? Or perhaps is there an issue of isolation going on here and loneliness? These are both terms that one of my PGRs used. She said that she found herself isolated and lonely, and it was a bit difficult to break out of that. So she appreciated my chasing after her by telephone and saying, haven't heard from you for a bit. I'm just checking up on you. You know, don't forget we're doing these things. There are these resources that are now available, etc. And that helps with the third point, the personal link with the PGRs. I spend so much more time on the phone now, and I suspect that's part of my new normal into the short and medium term future. And a lot of the support I've been offering is emotional, as well as academic and technical. Of course, it's my job to look after the academic and technical needs of my students. It's not really in my job description to look after their emotional needs, but when you're presented with postgraduate research students who are unhappy, feeling lonely, feeling anxious or stressed, again, you know, one falls back on human nature and stops and makes space to ask the question, you know, why are you feeling this way? Do you want to talk with me about feeling this way? What can we do to at least create a space where you can share those feelings? Because sharing those feelings is the beginning of starting to manage and deal with them. Whether or not I'm the right person to do that ultimately is a separate question. We've already talked about multiple anxieties. Some of our PGRs were also teachers, I've mentioned that, but some of them were also partners of key workers, some of whom might have gotten ill, and parents of children who needed to be looked after and homeschooled during the lockdown period. Finally, and this picks up on a point I made earlier, some PGRs have seen new research opportunities emerge out of this, this unexpected lockdown pandemic experience. Some of those opportunities are around COVID-19. I've got some students who are looking at availability of hand washing facilities in various study areas in the global south, because hand washing is a critical part of managing infection risk. So the challenge there is, what do we know about where those hand washing facilities are available, and where they're not available, what can we do about it? As water researchers operating at the natural science, engineering, social science interface. And not necessarily COVID related. My final point is I do have one student who's developed a side interest in what she calls the epistemic communities of Zoom, the way in which Zoom mediated conversations about her research subject area are different than the ones she had planned for, the in-person face-to-face focus groups and interviews. And she's interested in exploring how different is sometimes a good thing because it yields more data and information. And in other cases, it's perhaps not a good thing because it's limiting. So I've made some comments based on professional impacts, operational impacts, and personal impacts. We're really interested now to open up the discussion and hear from folks who've joined us today about their thoughts. Okay, so if Jessica and Robin could share their videos again, we've reassembled our panel virtually. I'll start with the first question I see in the webinar chat. Lucy, to all panelists, will new research funding for next year be affected? I think this is most directly in your wheelhouse, Robin, if you'd care to comment on perhaps what might be happening in coming weeks and months from a NERC perspective.
Well, yes, that's. I guess that does mostly fall in my area, I think. So the answer to this isn't straightforward, and one that we don't fully know the answer to at the moment, because actually we are in the middle of a spending review, and that means that currently a lot of the work that my colleagues and I are doing is around what the future of the research and innovation funding landscape looks like for the next 5 years. We're expecting a 5-year settlement in the spending review. I guess the key thing to say is we're not expecting that funding to go down, which is a positive story. And the other part of the positive story, I guess, is that we are hopeful that it will go up to match the ambition, I guess, and also the recognition that after a period of national crisis, actually often what is required is this kind of public investment in the research and development landscape as economic models, operating models, business models change, and the world looks different. And so I think we can expect funding to continue in the same way. At least, if not a more positive story than that. And that's certainly the main part of our activity that we're working towards at the moment.
So one of the other questions in the question and answer part of the Zoom call presses on that point a little and asks a little more specifically what might impact the number of PhDs available in the next couple of years.
So I think, I mean, the question looks, I think quite rightly at the kind of the fact that the talent strategy for UKRI is a long-term strategy. We're looking out over the next 5, 6, 7 years, not just over next year. And so the trajectory, again, similarly, is in the longer term upwards. But I think you pulled out a really good point that in my previous life would have been sort of talked about in terms of absorptive capacity and things. And so, actually, how many studentships can we fund in a context where actually sometimes opportunities are fewer, particularly moving into some of the non-academic sectors. And so, actually, we are looking more. That forces us to look more creatively about other parts of the UKRI and UK research and innovation system to look at how we can support transition into different parts of a career, and so looking at the kind of the key points of transition from postgraduate researcher to postdoc to sort of fellow to that kind of that type of transition, but also increasing funding for exploring mobility between sectors and moving from the private into academia to the public, and actually recognizing that if we are looking at a longer term ambition to provide environmental solutions to challenges that we see as a society and an economy, we're going to need people who have a breadth of experience and an ability to almost sort of understand the languages that are talked about differently in a private, public, and academic context. And so I think we currently expect PhDs to be maintained and possibly grow, but there's also scope for us to do different creative things, I think, if we do end up with a more positive spending review outcome in the next couple of years.
I suppose this question links to another question that's come up in the question and answers about future workforce. And the question specifically is about how the pandemic will impact future workforce, and specifically, what about the nexus between the environmental sector, which is seen to be shrinking, and PhDs in the environmental sector, and PhDs as part of the progression towards certain kinds of opportunity in this sector, which is itself transforming. I guess my own thought, I'll just jump in there, chair's prerogative, and just say, it feels to me like there's great change under heaven and the situation is excellent, to quote Chairman Mao. You probably didn't expect that. That is to say, yes, these are chaotic times. There is quite a lot of uncertainty out there. We haven't even used the B word. We barely even remember that we used to be preoccupied by nothing else until March of this year. So we know that for all kinds of reasons, the environmental sector is changing and transforming quite markedly. But it feels to me like PhD level study in the environmental sector will always have a place, and in fact might become even more important although it might have to change a little. It might have to take on a little bit more marketplace business savvy. I'm not quite sure how that works. In UE, we have two tracks. We've got a traditional postgraduate researcher PhD track, and then we've what's called a professional doctorate track. And it's often the professional doctorate track, which is taken up by people who are coming out of industry to do something quite specific with us before either writing the book they've always wanted to write or going back into industry to tackle the questions suitably armed. Robin, do you have any thoughts on, if you like, the nexus between the way in which we're training PhDs, however many of them there are, and the jobs market that might be out there for them when they're done?
So many thoughts. Well, so one of the things I struggle with a little bit is how one defines the environmental sector. And I guess I say that from the experience of my first role within NERC, and prior to that was actually as working in the innovation team. So really looking at how one translates research outcomes into tools, processes, approaches that are absorbed by non-academic institutions and organizations. That was really by design, and sort of a strategic decision by NERC at that point in 2011-12 to recognise that the applicability of environmental science to questions that businesses, policymakers, and other organisations ask is only increasing as pressures of environmental sustainability, the cultural impacts of environmental change, and wider societal impacts become part of the question of operating models and business models for the private sector. And also, there are some big questions that government needs to ask and answer that will require us to have a better understanding of the interconnectivity of systems that environmental science provides us, and the ability to not just look at a single issue and sort of an impact and an outcome. And I think that for me is one of the things, and one of the really interesting parts of my current portfolio is how do we train PhD students in a way that gives them that academic rigor, but also the wider perspective of how their skill set in that academic rigor will be received by those business organizations, public sector organizations. And there's a lot of, I guess there's a lot of skills that we can then translate into what we could eventually call an environmental sector, but the environmental sector could be as broad and as wide as we actually ever wanted it to be, because it's going to touch on everything that we need to do in the future. And so I think we have to look at the type of sort of training and preparation that we're actually giving to PhD students to allow them to actually not be constrained by a sector in the future, and to be able to think more broadly about how they fit and how their skills fit to the challenges and the issues that they need to engage with, and we as a society need to engage with going forward.
So the good news for current PhDs in environmental sciences like Jessica is that there will be jobs, both in publicly funded universities and research institutes and in the private sector, even though we know that currently we're in a period of flux and change, and not just related to COVID, but strongly linked currently to COVID. Jessica, I'm interested in your thoughts about how, as a PGR, you've been helped to prepare for different kinds of professional pathway.
So I mean, a lot of that has been through my funders. So during COVID, they've been running online Teams seminars with different panelists and speakers who have gone through different academic pathways. So we've had ones from people who stayed in the traditional academic pathway, ones from people who've gone into industry, and there was another one to looking at business. And actually, so it's been nice to hear about it. In terms of the actual preparation for it, a lot of the time that's something that I felt that you've kind of got to seek out yourself. It's not necessarily something that's readily offered, which actually kind of, as a PhD student, and you are kind of up to here in your own research, trying to then find that mental capacity to then also start thinking about the next step before you get to that next step can be a bit tricky, especially when actually we are starting to really worry. And so my housemate currently is applying for jobs. She's meant to finish her PhD within the next 3 months, and actually applying for jobs that are seen as entry level. And actually, even with a PhD, she's not getting anywhere near kind of even interview stage. So actually, that side of it is becoming possibly a little worrying, but actually there are more people who may have lost their jobs due to COVID. Therefore, there may be more environmental-esque jobs coming about, but you may have more people than normal applying for them, who may have other experience from other sectors and industries who got furloughed or laid off, who are now also competing for that same job market. There is also then, after kind of talking to family and friends, possibly the hope that due to lockdown and people actually starting to realise and maybe starting to appreciate their outdoor environment a little bit more, that maybe some extra kind of work and a bit more of a push will be put in to that sector, and people will start to realise actually it's important to start looking at your environmental impact, whether you're an industry or a business, to start to consider it a bit more. But it's all very much up in the air from a PhD kind of perspective, as to it doesn't seem particularly straight cut.
What that suggests to me, Jessica, is that probably people like me who are closer to the levers that actually shape and design PhD programs possibly need to think a little bit more about baking in support and training for alternative pathways, rather than just assuming that the different flavors of PhD on the shelf, traditional research PhD, ATP type PhD, or what we used to call a case studentship, which is very much an industry-facing PhD. I've also mentioned prof docs, professional doctorates. Rather than just assuming that as consumers, you'll make the choice of the right kind of PhD for you, possibly we need to give you a bit more professional resilience in the program, rather than just assuming you'll develop it by osmosis.
Mm-hmm. No, I agree, because I mean, I think there's still an expectation that a lot of PhDs may want to continue on in research and go do a postdoc or an equivalent, but actually there are then very limited jobs higher up than that, actually, in terms of like full-time, permanent kind of lectureships. They're very limited. So actually you get this bottleneck. You get everyone kind of going and doing the PhDs and the postdocs, and then there's not necessarily the positions for them to stay in academia. They then have to kind of swerve out and go into a different environmental sector or private research. But actually the skills to do that or to sidestep haven't necessarily been presented up front.
You a little on the spot, since you're a representative of one of the big UKRI family of funders. Does Jessica's experience imply that it should be incumbent upon universities, so that's me, I'm putting myself on the spot as well, and major funders such as yourself, to figure out some kind of a bridging program for folks? It could be as simple as PhD internships. I'm speculating, that would invite folks like Jessica in to help shape some of your programs, help learn a bit about how an institution like NERC works. Very useful if you're going in to a research career path, but possibly also adding value to your business, as well as helping this particular cohort of people who are in the position that Jess and her roommate are in, rather than earlier stage students or later stage students.
So short answer is yes, in both cases. I think that one of the things that the new Chief Executive of UK Research and Innovation, Ottilie Lysa, has brought explicitly to the fore that's been a concern of ours for the last few years is that we're there is something lacking in the funding offer, but also in how we engage with those that we are funding, specifically training grant holders to make that type of support available for. I talked about transitions and I talked about mobility and things. I think we are actively working on an offer in that space for the environmental science sort of space. I mean, I think in terms of coming to work directly for UKRI, which is sort of partly where some of your question was going, actually, one of the kind of key career spaces is probably into UK research and innovation. So most of my colleagues within the Research and Skills Directorate have an environmental science PhD and are connected to the communities that they would have written their PhD in, and maintain that as part of a connection with the environmental science, but not an academic career. And that's hugely valuable to us as an organisation to be able to shape the future research and innovation challenges that we look at in the environmental science sector, as well as in other councils as well. So yes, I definitely, that's something that we will definitely be looking at in the next phase of how we fund and how we invest in. And I guess we use the sort of the word advisedly, the talent that comes through the next generation of people in the employment market and skills more generally.
Okay, so the good news is there's something coming. It's being shaped, some kind of an offer that will target your cohort, Jess, based on a recognition that you guys face some very particular short and medium term challenges. That's really heartening to hear. From the point of view of my university, I'll say that we're doing the same thing. We're trying to say to ourselves, okay, look, how do we make a positive out of a negative? The negative was we were suddenly shut down, and that's had all kinds of consequences that we've been talking about for a while. But we know we're picking things up again and we're starting again. How do we then add even more value to the PhD journey that our students are on? It might be as simple as figuring out how to extend periods of registration. That's quite an operational thing. And we're going to have to do that anyway for all kinds of reasons. But it could also be, at least in my case, it's about reaching out to my stakeholders, who are mostly water companies and consultancies, and saying, what can we do that's a bit special? This is very, a very different, unexpected challenge. So let's be unexpected. Let's think the unexpected and do something a bit wild and wacky to help our current PGRs become tomorrow's powerful professionals. And I'll be honest, I think that all the stakeholders I work with in the environmental consultancy and water value chain are, in different ways, I think they're taking that challenge seriously. Yeah. Difficult to offer internship experiences via Zoom, but I know of some stakeholders who are actually doing that and started in the last few weeks. They're desperately hoping they get to open up a bit more so that folks like yourself, Jess, can go out and take some soil samples from around reservoirs. But I think it's very brave of them to embark not knowing on the argument that it's worse to not embark.
Yeah.
Okay. A question possibly that might take us to the conclusion of this webinar is about the role of PSRBs, public statutory regulatory bodies, or societies like IES. We're being hosted. This seminar is hosted and presented by the IES. I'm assuming that most of the participants are probably IES members. Some of the programs at my university are accredited by the IES, so we work with IES a fair bit. And I think it's an interesting question. What could organizations like IES do to help? Not sure I have any easy answers, but I'll start in one place, and that is most professional bodies like IES or SciWem, two of the ones I deal with most, have competence threshold-based membership requirements. And I think it would probably be very helpful if two things happened, and they may well be happening within IES. First, if there's some recognition for new members and student members like Jess, that it's perhaps a little bit challenging for them to meet the threshold criteria exactly as published, because these are not normal times. So if you're saying to a new member like Jess, you need X hours of primary field work, well, that might be hard to achieve for a while. And it's quite beyond the prospective member's control. So I would hope that groups like the IES would perhaps figure out how to relax some of those COVID-sensitive membership requirements. And then maybe at the same time, think about how they too can be part of adding new value to the PhD journey. Perhaps not just through workshops like this, which are generally useful in terms of sharing our experience and the challenges we're facing, but maybe more specifically useful if we're able to identify things that current PGRs could really use, and that IES or its members could possibly help provide.
So, I mean, I guess I'd add to that, just going back to the previous conversation, you know, I guess the PSRBs do provide a route to provide kind of up-to-date guidance and information, and to a certain extent, probably lobby is not the right word, but put information out there that could change policy and adjust policy, and actually drawing on the expertise of so PGRs to actually input into those as internship or placement-based type projects. You know, adds value and potentially adds diversity to future CVs, I guess, in terms of that experience of being able to translate research outcomes and research knowledge into something that influences in a slightly different way. You know, certainly I know that we have supported in the past that type of placement internship through NERC funding, and it's been hugely valuable to both parties in terms of that type of opportunity.
Yeah. So actually, as well as IES, I'm also a member of BS Cubed through my for my PhD. So all STARS students are made automatic members of BS Cubed through the funding. And actually, it's through the BS Cubed conferences and the meetings, which unfortunately aren't happening in person at the minute, but actually they've been my best source of networking, because they tend to be much smaller. Everybody there is a soil scientist or a farmer or a soil policy maker. And actually, that's been a great support actually for myself and other PGRs involved in soil, to actually get out there to talk, to have your own presentations as well, and actually within a very small specialist body of people. So that, yeah, they are very helpful in that sense as well.
That's brilliant. I just want to say thank you to Chad. You stole my closing question, which I was going to ask all of you, because I saw that coming in the chat box. You're scribbling down your ideas frantically. That's brilliant. That's exactly what we want to hear. We are very much a member-led organisation and want to respond to the members and the professionals that we're there to support. So they are definitely things that we will certainly explore and see if we can put almost all of them in action. The PhD hours, I think, is a really important point. So we have an accreditation scheme where we support students who are on accredited undergrad courses and master's courses, and there is a separate entry route for them where hours are not counted. It's just the completion of your academic course essentially. But for those that aren't PhD students on accredited courses with us, we will certainly look at that, because I can fully appreciate the delay that you have all had to face, and therefore those hours won't necessarily correlate as accurately as they would have done in previous years. So thank you, that's really, really useful. I'd just like to also thank you all for speaking so openly and so frankly about your experiences. It's really refreshing, and it's a really good insight into hearing what different sectors and different individuals in those sectors have actually experienced during this time. I think it's fair to say that it's been challenging for an awful lot, but it's really nice to hear you speak so openly about your journeys, and I hope, certainly Jessica, the rest of your PhD experience goes incredibly well, and that come September next year, you are a very content, happy graduated student. So I really hope that the next chapter is a really positive part for you. And Chad, yes, I hope that your students also have a positive experience, and that you as a supervisor can have a little bit of a breathing space, I guess, moving forward, and you get some support coming in to support you as a group.
I don't see that happening for some time yet.
Yeah. But yeah, and Robin, thank you for sharing some of the insight as to what might be coming out of UKRI and NERC especially, and what some of the opportunities on the horizon might be there for the group. So thank you all to attendees who actually registered and completed this webinar. If you are an IES member, you're able to record this as CPD, so you can log into the IES members area and record it in there. In a month's time, we do actually have another forum, which is on a similar vein. It's going to be looking at how environmental scientists or professionals who handle data are working with a COVID-19 data set. So obviously it's a huge anomaly in large, long-standing research projects, and how professionals are actually managing that from monitoring stations and all different specialisms. So if that's of interest, do sign up for that. Again, it's free to attend. But yeah, that's going to be in October, and hopefully it'll be quite interesting to hear how some people are actually dealing with this anomaly year, and hopefully not an anomaly 2 years. So yes, so thank you very much. We've finished bang on time. Thank you hugely to all of our speakers. I hope that was beneficial for yourselves and for all attendees who are involved. And let's continue this discussion. We will certainly share these slides and the outcomes of this discussion today, and hopefully it will just be the start of a long-standing debate that we will have amongst professionals in the sector. So thank you very much all for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.